you'll notice a bunch of these red boxes. Basically, the way I ended up doing this was that like each screen is basically going to be its own zone, is what I ended up calling them. And I can just set as a starting zone, so next time I play I'll be in here. But yeah, this zone script here started off as something a lot simpler. But I decided that I didn't want the camera exactly tracking the player. I think I wanted it to have an interesting, the idea of it, kind of like an NES game or something, like an old school one where every time you move off the screen, you move on to a new screen and it just sort of like updates. Um, so it's a static camera more or less, but the camera will move to each of the individual zones. But then once I decided that, I needed a way to basically see where all the zones were. So I created a simple zone script that just, let me open this up really quick. This zone script started off really simple, and then over time it grew into something more complicated and useful for more scenarios, basically. I basically just started off with, oh, here's a draw a gizmo, a box, draw a wire cube around the bounds of the zone, which is basically set. I wanted like a 2:1 aspect ratio is what I decided on. So that's just, each zone is at least 2:1. Some can be bigger, like this one. The aspect ratio is the same currently, I think. No, actually you can change it now. There's been a couple of changes, but yeah, it has to be at least this big because that's just the size of the camera. So it can't be smaller than this for a screen, but it can be bigger. Yeah, and then over time, I just added some features. I was like, okay, well, I've already got this script that I have to have on stuff. So I might as well add some extra functionality, right? Like, what did I start off with? Probably entering and exiting zones, having events for those. So basically there's a script that keeps track of the player's position. I think that's the zone manager here. And when you move into the bounds of another zone, basically it has a list of all the zones in the game. And when you move, it'll check if the player's position is it within the bounds of any of the zones. And if it is, it'll switch to that new zone. So if like the player moves from here to here, it'll take the camera and move it from here, and it'll basically, set the new zone as the current zone. So it'll move the camera over as well. So then I added that. And then whenever you enter a zone or exit a zone, you can trigger an event. When you enter a zone on the first time playing the game, you can have an event. So for like a story thing that's only going to run the first time you enter, or for example, when you're falling, you actually get teleported to this really big section over here, and your fall speed on the character is modified so that it falls at a slower rate, and so it fits more with the music and just sort of the theme of, it's taking some time to get down, a bit more dramatic, I guess. But then when you come back into the zone here or something, oh, I guess it's not here. Must be on my trigger here. Yeah. I mean, I could set it when you enter the zone for the first time, but also there's a trigger down here that when you enter it, it'll reset the fall speed. But let's see, I have basically every zone in here in the Haven area has on enter stuff because of the dialogue runs when you enter the zone for the first time. But then if you leave and come back, it won't replay it, so that's really neat. But then I wanted to sort of, yeah, at first I had the zones fixed to just the small areas, but then I wanted to add functionality to be able to increase their size. And so I had a single value where I could just like uniformly scale it, which is mostly how all of these boxes are set up anyway. They're all 2:1 ratios like this one, but they're just bigger and bigger. But I did eventually add functionality to allow it for, I'll just take this one, and I can change the length to a value, and the height to a value. And the camera itself, there's a virtual camera inside each of these zones as well that can be customly set up, so you can turn it on. By default, it just uses like a normal virtual camera that's following the player around. But you can also have specific virtual cameras set up for each zone. So like each of them has a zone virtual camera using Cinemachine, because Cinemachine's pretty great. But Yeah, so if you want one that's just like a camera that's zoomed out for the whole screen here, I think there's an option actually for that. Override camera size. It'll sort of like zoom out for the whole, so you can see the whole screen, or you can have it to where it'll stay the same size and it'll just be like, if it's in this big zone here, it'll just be in this corner thing and then it'll start following the player around. So it's sort of like as you can think like Metroid when you go to a new room, uh, it's a big area, but the camera follows the player around. But sometimes there are individual rooms where the camera just stays still, basically acting like that. Um, but yeah, I just kept adding functionality. Oh, the zone IDs are very useful because it ties in with the dialogue system, which I'll be making another video about the dialogue system and how I'm sort of integrating that as well. But basically, each zone will have a specific ID, and then there's a bunch of these markers, or what have I called them? Reference points inside each zone that right now are mostly being used to move characters during dialogue. I need to rename them, but basically they're going to have the zone name and then an identifier for which point they are inside of that zone. So each zone needed like a specific identifier so that I could easily rename stuff, um, or easily, tie stuff between the dialogue and the game. And if I move stuff around, it's not going to completely break, or if I rename a couple things, it's not going to completely break or whatever. Which to that end also brought in this sort of the parenting zones. So for example, these ones down here, this section isn't parented under anything. So these just have numbers in their identifiers here, which is just a text mesh pro thing, identifier text here. It's just a text mesh pro that I have reference to, and I just update it on, what's it called? Verify? On validate, that's what it is. I just do some bunch of stuff here where I just get the information about the zone and I set it up. So that's only running in the editor, and once the actual game is running, that's basically set in stone. But I use that and I populate the name of the thing here. Each zone can have a name in and of itself. So for example, down here, this one's called hideaway entrance. This is the treadmill room because there'll be a treadmill in here. Workout room for something later, and then you can parent these under other zone things. So there's a zone parent script, and each zone parent has an identifier which goes before the ID of the zone. And then when it's parented, the zone will be local coordinate space instead of world. So like these ones are set up in world coordinate space, more or less. Like it says 1 and then 2. It's not actually like 2 units across. It's 2, I guess, quote unquote, relative units of the 1:2 aspect ratio. So each of these 1:2 spaces is basically a grid cell, a cell grid, a space on the grid, like a stretched out grid. So this is the 0, 0 grid. This is the 1, 0, 2, 0, or the 1, 0, -1 grid, like on a coordinate thing. But then those are like set in world space. But then if I have them parented, they'll be in local space, so I can actually like move around the whole area, and it won't mess with the coordinates at all. So if I need to sort of like move areas around, like this haven area is probably going to have to get moved up a lot because I have some plans for adding more stuff above this area. So being able to just rearrange things like that and being able to keep their identifiers the same is very, very helpful. And it also helps in just understanding where things are in space. And like if I have to modify an object, like for example, I need to move these washing machines. It's like, oh, I'm in the 3-1 laundry room. So that's the zone I'm in. And then I can come down and change all that stuff. Or I can just like click on the name or something and pop up into the zone area. It's very useful.